WNYC Studios is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Joining us now is Ben Rhodes. You may know him as a former Deputy National Security Advisor and speechwriter for President Barack Obama. He wrote a lot of Obama's most well-known speeches, or co-host of Pod Save the World, or as a New York Times best-selling author and a New York Times contributor. He is out with a new book, All We Say, The Battle for American Identity, A History in 15 Speeches, which traces the 250-year argument over what it means to be American through 15 pivotal speeches. It starts with Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention and goes all the way to President Donald Trump's second inaugural address last year. And with these speeches, he argues that there are actually two competing stories of American exceptionalism, and they have always coexisted, but in tension with each other. One story is rooted in a particular identity, maybe call it white, Christian, native-born, and the other is rooted in a universal idea of equality drawn from the Declaration of Independence. So Ben Rhodes joins us now. Hey, thanks for coming on. Congratulations on the book. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks, Brian. It's so good to talk to you.
You wanted to say briefly first, since you're best known probably as a foreign policy expert, why a book of speeches from history about American identity?
Well, my last book was about the rise of authoritarianism, and I looked at Putin, I looked at Trump, I looked at Viktor Orban in Hungary, Xi Jinping, and what I found in trying to understand what had happened to global politics today is how central history was to those types of leaders, because essentially what a strongman does is make all of history a prequel to their ascent, their leadership. And I also kind of felt that Trump and Obama, in addition to kind of being on opposite sides of the current political spectrum, embodied these two different stories. Not that Obama is perfect in any way, but he represented this kind of progressive exceptionalism of struggling to live up to an idea, whereas Trump really represented this idea of inherited exceptionalism. You know, we can do whatever we want, quite literally, because we're American. And given that I'm not an historian, but I am a speechwriter, and a speechwriter who used to draw on past speeches to do my own work, I knew that there would be a rich set of materials to mine, because if you go back and you look at speeches from history, they're kind of history in the present tense. So that gave me the idea of telling this one story about America and our battle over identity through a number of speeches.
Before we get to some excerpts from some of the speeches you identified from the last 40 years, you want to do a few from, really earlier in American history. I'm curious why you started with a Benjamin Franklin speech, in particular from the Constitutional Convention. And then I see that Frederick Douglass, who we don't have any tape of, unfortunately, is very central to the book. So talk about Benjamin Franklin's speech, and we'll talk a little bit about Frederick Douglass, too.
Yeah, I mean, the goal here was this is not an anthology, right? Each chapter is about an argument and a person who made that argument and a moment in time. And so I didn't want the 15 greatest hits here. I wanted a representative sample of different sides of the argument. And Franklin was the perfect starting place, because Ben Franklin authored the closing argument for the Constitution at the convention in Philadelphia. He was an old man. He was into his 80s. He couldn't even stand because he had gout and kidney stones. And the speech he wrote doesn't even talk about the Constitution. It talks about compromise and the essential need for compromise. When you get people together in a room, you not only get their different wisdom, you get their different interests, their different prejudices, and nobody's going to get everything they want in that kind of assembly. And I think, in addition to just being a very wise and even entertaining speech, because Franklin had a very almost comic and satirical voice, it kind of captured something essential to me, which is that compromise made the Union possible. But we also compromised about pretty enormous things: human slavery, the kind of nature of citizenship and who can access that. Immigration was kind of set aside for states. And so in a way, we've been fighting about the things we compromised over ever since, because we set up a system of government, but we didn't resolve these questions of identity and citizenship and who gets to be American and what that means and who decides that question. And so each speech that followed, in the first five, I sample different sides of that. I have a Seneca chief who says, well, wait a second, we're left out of your compromise. And then I have a black woman abolitionist named Maria Stewart in 1830s Boston who says, wait a second, black people and women want these rights. And then Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, comes along and says, well, we're resolving those compromises. Actually, slavery and white supremacy is going to be the cornerstone of our new nation, the Confederacy. And then Lincoln comes along and says, no, actually, we're resolving this compromise as an abolitionist nation that has an opportunity to second founding of the United States with the end of the Civil War. And I take you on that quick journey because that argument in some ways has just been repeating itself ever since. It's just that the issues and characters changed.
Is it too disconnected from that particular journey through history that you just took us on to say that there's even tension in the Democratic Party today between compromise as a value to cherish and try to push forward that's been lost in our polarized society versus compromise as a kind of capitulation when really there should be a fight for the most robust equality and justice that the country can obtain?
That's exactly true in the Democratic Party. I feel that tension every day. I mean, you mentioned Douglas. The speech he gave that I used is a speech during Reconstruction in which he defended Chinese immigration because his view was, if I do stand for universal principles, I need to defend them for Chinese migrants who are working on the railroads and the farms just as much as I wanted people to defend my rights as a black man. And I'm sure that position did not poll well in the 1860s. But now that's kind of the voice of the activist. And the thing about American politics is, you tend to need both, right? You need to have people who are uncompromising and who are willing to sacrifice their reputations or in some cases even their bodies for progress. But you also need compromise to keep the system going. I think what's bedeviled Democrats in recent years, though, is that people don't even really seem to know what they believe. There's such a kind of caution about not wanting to lose an election and about wanting to find the phrase that is the least offensive or the kind of issue, healthcare subsidies is the one that everybody can agree on. So that's what we're going to talk about. And so to me, the issue is less, I get that Democrats are going to be on an ideological spectrum and there's going to have to be a role for legislative compromise at times. But I think the bigger problem in the Trump decade is a lot of people that don't follow politics closely look at the party and just are really not sure what it stands for and what it's willing to fight over. And I think that contributes to some of the kind of apathy and cynicism you felt creeping in.
Listeners, we can take some texts and phone calls, maybe especially on a question related to the book. Is there a speech by a president, an activist, or any other public figure from any of the 250 years of American history that changed your understanding of what it means to be an American? Because that's the theme of Ben Rhodes' new book, right, is American identity, as told through 15 speeches from the last 250 years. Give us a call if you have one for you, or if you always wanted to ask Ben Rhodes a question, but the PodSave podcast didn't take calls, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. You can call or you can text. Your Ronald Reagan chapter is called God and Country, and it's about his 1983 Evil Empire speech to the National Association of Evangelicals in Orlando. And your argument, your framing of the speech is really interesting because you think it's misremembered. What people remember is it was a Cold War speech. Evil Empire. Is that the one in which he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, or did that come later?
That came later, but it's kind of paired with that speech as these moments of kind of moral clarity from Reagan calling out the Soviets.
But you write that 2/3 of it was actually a domestic agenda, right-wing positions on abortion, school prayer, parental rights under religious and patriotic umbrella. So let's take a listen to about a minute of that speech that you featured in your Reagan chapter.
I want you to know that this administration is motivated by a political philosophy that sees the greatness of America in you, her people, and in your families, churches, neighborhoods, communities, the institutions that foster and nourish values like concern for others and respect for the rule of law under God. Now, I don't have to tell you that this puts us in opposition to, or at least out of step with, a prevailing attitude of many who have turned to a modern-day secularism, discarding the tried and time-tested values upon which our very civilization is based. No matter how well-intentioned, their value system is radically different from that of most Americans. And while they proclaim that they're freeing us from superstitions of the past, they've taken upon themselves the job of superintending us by government rule and regulation. Sometimes their voices are louder than ours, but they are not yet a majority.
Ronald Reagan, 1983. You know what jumps out at me from that, Ben? And then, of course, you'll put it in the context of what you emphasized in the book. The distinction that he's making is between religion and secularism. And what that leaves out, to my idea, is any notion of progressive Christianity or progressive Judaism or Islam or any other religion. But now you go. Why'd you include that?
Brian, it's such an important insight. And first of all, you know, one of the arguments of the book is that words matter. And in that speech, you hear how Reagan, you know, almost quite literally through the 70s and into the early 80s, spoke into being this new coalition where he put an umbrella under Christian evangelicals, being much more politicized, kind of small government, libertarian, free marketeers who tend not to have a lot in common with Christian evangelicals at times, and then kind of national security hawks. You know, this became the Republican Party. It wasn't the Republican Party before Ronald Reagan. And what the way he did this is, if you listen to that speech, again, the first 2/3 of it is culture war stuff, right? It's abortion, it's prayer in school, all the issues that we've come to live with, and only then does he get to the Soviet Union. But you can hear it in the clip. What he's constructing is a worldview in which the thing that unites all those factions of the Republican Party is kind of opposition to this state, this kind of secular state that wants to control your lives. He talks about the communists in the Soviet Union believing in the rule of man, not the rule of God. He has a very kind of jarring anecdote of someone who comes up to him and says, I'd rather my kids die rather than grow up to be communists. So it's pretty, you know, even though it's genial, it's pretty strident in its views. And look, I think there are a couple of things I take away from that is one, just the skill he had to cohere this coalition that dominated American politics for decades and ultimately kind of evolved in a darker direction into MAGA. And importantly, to your point, Brian, he's trying to build up to calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, but there's not a giant leap from like secular bureaucrats in the United States, you know, the kind of great society administrative state. They're kind of adjacent to the people that he's saying or have these radical beliefs. And so kind of set the groundwork. Even though Reagan put a much more gentle face, he said they're well-intentioned. You know, Trump would never say that his opponents are well-intentioned.
Right.
You can see how the thing he created could some people like him could lose control of it, and it could be weaponized by Trump, who says, yes, you know, now that the Soviet Union's gone, the enemy is within. And, you know, everything from Doge to mass deportation, you know, it kind of fits with this idea that we need to dismantle this kind of radical secular thing, which is, again, when I go back into history, progressive faith groups were part of every justice movement, you know, civil rights, abolition, suffrage. There's a huge tradition of progressive Christianity, progressive Judaism, and more recently progressive Islam in this country. And so I think Reagan also kind of elided the fact that, you know, throughout American history, it's actually faith groups that are usually on the progressive side of these questions.
A number of listeners are identifying Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is Your 4th of July" line and speech. And, you know, I feel like people are so much more aware of that line than when I was a kid and the 4th of July would come around, and it wouldn't be, certainly wasn't in school, you know, when I was a kid, and it wasn't in the media as much as it is now. But talk about Frederick Douglass and maybe that line and that speech in particular.
Yeah, well, first of all, I understand that, Brian. I mean, I think I'm old enough that patriotism was a relatively simple thing. You know, I mean, my memories growing up include like the, 1986 celebration of the Statue of Liberty's birthday, and it was fireworks and feeling good. I do think that there's been an appropriate enlarging of our conception of history, and if you look at Douglass, it was remarkable to relive his life story. Obviously, he even before he escaped slavery, he becomes drawn to oratory, and he was practicing under a tree before other slaves from the Columbian Oratory Anthology. And he escapes, and he pretty immediately kind of gets embedded in the black church in the Northeast, where the abolitionist movement is building. And he hooks up with William Lloyd Garrison, who was a leading kind of white abolitionist, published the Liberator, the newspaper that was anti-slavery. And he starts hitting the circuit and building a following. And he helps speak this abolitionist movement into a greater mainstream. And he challenges his audiences. And so What to the Slave is the 4th of July, is him standing in front of an audience that is, mixed race and telling a really hard truth that you all can celebrate this holiday in a way that I can't because of my identity. And he kind of has a Jeremiah style where you call out the nation for its sins, and then you insist upon a path of redemption that involves reckoning with those sins, and obviously not only dismantling slavery, but acknowledging the true nature and crimes of it. And so I think what speaks to people about that speech is, well, wait a second, there's more to our history than the kind of sugar-coated version that we're going to see at the America 250 celebrations on the mall, although that's going to be a little weird. But actually I find that's hopeful, Brian. Like, it's hopeful to remember that there were times that, were worse than these times. You had slavery going on, and people were willing to say, wait a second, this nation is about ideas, and we cannot rest until we hold this nation accountable to those ideas. Like, that's not, I don't see that as a negative view of American history. I actually see it as a profoundly positive one.
Ben Rhodes with us, if you're just joining us, co-chair of the group National Security Action, former national security official under President Barack Obama, a speechwriter for Obama as well. And his new book is All We Say, The Battle for American Identity, A History in 15 Speeches. And you made a conscious decision when you came to Obama not to focus on the one that probably everybody who was paying any attention to politics at that time in 2004 remembers, when he was a speaker at the Democratic Convention 4 years before he got elected president, when he said, there's not a red America and a blue America, there's one America. You focus on his Philadelphia speech about race during the 2008 campaign. And you write about seeing a draft, and it was pages of Obama's own handwriting in red, underlined lettering, included on some of the passages. So you, as a speechwriter, didn't write that speech. John Favreau, who was a speechwriter at that time, director of speechwriting for the campaign, didn't write that speech. So before we play an excerpt from that Philadelphia More Perfect Union speech, you want to set it up?
Yeah, so for people who may not remember, we were kind of on our way to the nomination, it seemed, on that Obama campaign. And then these clips started to emerge of Reverend Jeremiah Wright, his pastor, kind of excoriating America. It was one of the first viral moments on the internet. And we were losing altitude fast. And he decided he had to give a speech about this. We shorthanded this as the race speech because we always knew he might have to kind of more directly address the question of race. And Favreau helped produce a draft for him. And what I remember is he pulled an all-nighter, Brian. Like, Obama stayed up all night. We get this sent back to us, and he's kind of kept the first page. And then there, in red track changes, is 8 or 9 pages of the most personal and I think best speech I'd seen from Obama. And then there's a few paragraphs at the end. And so he not only personalized it, It felt like this came pouring out of him because he'd wanted to say these things for a long time. And frankly, the Reverend Wright controversy became a vehicle for him to be able to tell the whole story, essentially, of who he was and why he was trying to become president.
So, a minute of Barack Obama, More Perfect Union, 2008.
I chose to run for president at this moment in history because I believe deeply that we cannot solve the challenges of our time unless we solve them together, unless we perfect our union by understanding that we may have different stories, but we hold common hopes, that we may not look the same and may not have come from the same place, but we all want to move in the same direction towards a better future for our children and our grandchildren. And this belief comes from my unyielding faith in the decency and generosity of the American people. But it also comes from my own story. I'm the son of a black man from Kenya and a white woman from Kansas. I was raised with the help of a white grandfather who survived a depression to serve in Patton's army during World War II, and a white grandmother who worked on a bomber assembly line at Fort Leavenworth while he was overseas. I've gone to some of the best schools in America, and I've lived in one of the world's poorest nations.
So one of the things that I found so interesting, Ben, is that you compare the Reagan speech that we heard from 1983 and that Obama speech from 2008, in this theme of the book, American Identity. They both brought together several seemingly disparate groups under their respective tents. So how do these speeches that we just heard excerpts from tie together for you?
Well, I think they both build coalitions through words. And, Obama in that speech, when he addresses race, famously he says he could no more disown Jeremiah Wright than his white grandmother, who he loves, who raised him, who also said racist things that made him cringe. And in miniature, what he's saying there is, look, we all carry with us biases, complexities. There are great things about Reverend Wright and offensive things. And if we looked in our own families, we would find that complexity. I think Americans are much more willing to show grace to one another personally than increasingly politically. But then importantly, pulls back the lens. And yes, he talks about black structural inequality and income gap and education gap, but then he talks about the white working class. And it's very resonant today. He says, these are people who don't feel particularly privileged by their race, is the line. And he talks about their jobs being shipped overseas. He talks about the ways in which, if they have concerns about crime, they're called racist. And again, building out from his grandmother and Reverend Wright, look, we need to see each other, that we have more in common than these issues like race that are used to divide us. And that allowed him to build a coalition that, yes, was anchored in young people and people of color and white liberals, but also he won back those Reagan Democrats, those people that may not agree with Barack Obama on every cultural and social issue, but just thought, well, he's making sense. Like, I'd rather have politics focused on, getting me health care or better schools. And so I think there was an interesting competition between how Reagan, built a majority and then how Obama did, with some overlapping people in the working class of this country. Trump comes along and kind of detonates the whole thing. And it was kind of an interesting, dizzying journey to go Reagan, Obama to Trump, because you see three different ways in which people got to a majority. Now, Obama and Reagan's majorities were healthier and larger, I think, because they had, even though I disagree with Reagan's message, they presented them in a more unifying way. And I think that speech for Obama was the kind of final barrier he had to clear to being president, that, like, look, I'm in this as a black man who wants to exalt and advance the progress of civil rights, but I also have a politics that is designed to kind of put aside the divisive identity concerns so that we can actually solve problems for people.
So completing that arc with the detonation, as you just called it, at least 49 seconds of it, here's Trump from his second inaugural address last year.
My recent election is a mandate to completely and totally reverse a horrible betrayal and all of these many betrayals that have taken place, and to give the people back their faith, their wealth, their democracy, and indeed their freedom. From this moment on, America's decline is over. Our liberties and our nation's glorious destiny will no longer be denied, and we will immediately restore the integrity, competency, and loyalty of America's government.
So he's using words there like democracy and liberties and integrity and competency. But how did you interpret it?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about what's similar and what's different in Trump. I had that kind of in the back of my head as I was working on this book and reliving 250 years because, just to pick one thing out, Brian, one similarity is there's traces of Reagan in there, right? The clip you played about kind of the radical, secularism of the bureaucracy and the kind of implicit digs at certain kind of establishments and elites. Reagan had a campaign slogan in 1980 that was "Make America Great Again." So there's a kind of always been this strain of nostalgia, this strain of resistance to a larger government focused on things like civil rights or social safety net. There's always been a kind of populism of the white working class that wants to smash the establishment. There have been periodic backlashes to, obviously, immigration in this country. So there's things that run into Trump. He's a more familiar figure from American history than I think we would like to acknowledge, or at least some of us. At the same time, though, there are things that are profoundly different. Franklin set up a system rooted in compromise, and so the idea is that we're gonna fight it out in this system. Trump kind of in that speech and in his politics removes himself from the competition and places himself above it. Like if you listen to the language just in that clip, there's no it's over. He won. He has custody of the country. He has custody of the government, like it's his. He has custody of the American story, and you see that in the way in which he's trying to kind of, be the conductor of this 250th celebration. In the inaugural, he says, "I was saved by God to save America, or to make America great again," referring to his assassination attempt. I mean, Reagan was shot and nearly killed, and no one could imagine Ronald Reagan saying, "I was saved by God." So to me, Trump's, where he departs from history is in how singularly it is about him. And he doesn't kind of respect the idea that, we may have, vicious disagreements in this country, but we fight them out within the agreed upon lines. He kind of wants to be able to step outside those lines. And I think that's one reason why politics feels so existential and disorienting right now.
So I think a lot of Democrats wonder how far can the country come back from Trump after Trump? Is there a kind of speech, to the theme of your book, 15 speeches from American history, that you think could be instrumental in doing that?
I do, because I think part of what's happened in the last decade, as much because of social media as because of Trump, and those things are symbiotic, is we've kind of lost the ability to give speeches. And that means we've lost the ability to make good arguments or to listen to whole arguments. And actually, sometimes I think Democrats try too hard to mimic Trump. We're gonna troll people on social media. We're gonna curse more. When in fact the ultimate counter-programming to Trump would be to stand up and tell a story about what's happening in this country and to make people believe that we can move in a different direction. I mean, part of what an autocrat tries to do is grind you down and make you believe that it's hopeless, that political action is futile. When history shows in this country that's not the case. But I do think people need something to grab onto in terms of a message. I also think if you look at history, America is not going to look the same as it did before Trump. And so I think we don't want to be, Democrats shouldn't repeat the mistake of make America great again, that we're nostalgic for some past. But if you look at, like, say, the Gilded Age, which is not a bad comparison for what's happening now, massive inequality, corruption, government being more and more distant from people. Well, that was followed by a progressive era that didn't just build a social safety net in this country. Right. It had women's suffrage and direct election centers. So I think we're ripe for a different America emerging on the other end of this. That is both rooted in a story about kind of how we can maintain a shared identity in this country, and also rooted in pretty fundamental reforms to how government works.
Very interesting potential long-term view. And it would be a good place to end, except I can't resist the temptation, given what you did with Obama, to ask you one foreign policy question. And just in 1 minute's time, no matter what we think of the decision to start this war back in February, here we are. So if you were advising the president now, what standard of ending the war do you think the U.S. should adhere to regarding the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's nuclear program and materials?
I think the reality, Brian, is he has to accept that he's not going to accomplish these objectives he set at the beginning of the war. The regime is certainly not going to be removed. You're not going to eliminate entirely their nuclear program, or certainly their ballistic missile program, which he had been talking about. The best we can hope for now is you make a deal to reopen that Strait of Hormuz and lift the U.S. blockade on Iran. Iran is going to have to get some revenue from its frozen oil reserves that are caught up in our sanctions. And then you accept a nuclear deal that is probably not that dissimilar from Obama's, where they're going to have restrictions on their program and they're going to get rid of their stockpile like they did in the past. And hopefully there's a good inspections regime to verify that. But again, they're going to have to they'll have to get some money in return from sanctions relief. And I think Trump keeps waiting for there to be some more apparent victory. But I think anybody who's followed this issue for a long time knows that Iran's not going to capitulate completely. And so ultimately, this is going to be a deal that is frankly not that dissimilar from the Obama one that Trump pulled out of.
Ben Rhodes, contributor to MS Now and the New York Times, co-chair of National Security Action, an advisor on national security, and a speechwriter for former President Obama, author now of All We Say, The Battle for American Identity, A History in 15 Speeches. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Brian.